Okay, good morning Year 9 and welcome to the work for week 7. General instructions are the same as normal, so remember to complete all the tasks in yellow boxes. And just so you know, for this week, the work that we'd like you to send in is on slides 17 and 18. So it's a little review task at the end of the work. Okay, let's make a start then. What we're going to begin with today is just doing a little recap of the work from last week. So you don't have to write anything down for this, but just listen as we recap some key points. Okay, so first of all, we've got obviously January 1919, the Spartacus Uprising. This was the first real challenge to the Weimar Republic, which had only been formed on the 9th of November 1918. Now, the Spartacists, if you remember, were 50,000 people led by Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who wanted to create a communist state. But they were crushed, weren't they, by the Freikorps, the right-wing ex-soldiers. And then those soldiers thought in March 1920, after they were really bitter about the Treaty of Versailles and the military restrictions that had been brought in place, they decided to have their own rebellion called the Kapp Putsch. Remember, Putsch just means revolt or rebellion. So we've got that one. And then obviously last week as well, you looked at the rise of the Nazis and you looked at the Munich Putsch. And you saw all about how Hitler had been building up this private army called the SA, the Brown Shirts, and how he tried to take over Munich in 1923. Now, as well as that, we have briefly mentioned as well about the fact that there were 376 political assassinations, mostly by the right wing. 354 of them were carried out by right-wing people. So we've seen there's been lots of political challenges to the Weimar Republic. And this week, we're going to be looking at challenges to the Weimar Republic. But instead of looking at political challenges, we're going to be focused on economic challenges. Now, before we begin looking at the economic problems of the Weimar Republic, I want you just to have a little think about what would you spend £22 million on? Let's say you won the lottery and you got 22 million, which is the equivalent of about 200 billion German gold marks. So just pause the video for a second and think about what would you spend that money on? The 200 billion marks that we just talked about, if you won the lottery, what would you spend it on? You probably had all these grand plans about houses, I don't know, buying football clubs, clothes, whatever. But if we're thinking about Germany and what you could buy for 200 billion marks in 1923, you could only buy one loaf of bread. So we're going to be looking at today lots of different economic problems. We're going to be looking at hyperinflation, and we're going to see how this caused such a massive disruption to the German economy. I mean, look at this picture here. This is a picture of children stacking banknotes. This picture here is of a woman putting paper money into a fire for kindling. So she's burning money because it's cheaper than buying wood. And this guy here he is sweeping money down into a drain rather than picking it up. So we're going to be looking at this really big economic problem called hyperinflation, which is caused by another problem that we're going to look at first. Let's get our title down for today. So as I say every week, if you could please put this down on a piece of lined paper if you've got some, if not in an exercise book. And the title for today is Why Was the Ruhr Crisis and Hyperinflation a Problem? So we're going to look to be able to describe what happened in both the Ruhr and with hyperinflation. Then we're going to be trying to build on that if we can and actually explain why hyperinflation happened. And then the top grade, 7 to 9, is us being able to make a reasoned judgment about which one posed a greater threat for the Weimar Republic. And that's going to be a task that you're going to send in later today. Okay, so first of all, I'd like you to put a new subheading of Recap, the Treaty of Versailles and Government Debt. And what I'd like you to do is, without looking back at your notes if you can, just try and make some bullet points about Germany's financial position after the war. So you might want to think about the following things. Things like what had the Kaiser done to cause financial problems before the First World War, what the Treaty of Versailles had said about reparations, and what else the government had to pay for after the war. So try and have a go without looking at the answers on the next slide and just see what you can remember about the economic problems for Germany after the First World War. Okay, so pause it here so you can do that. Let's just go over the answers that you might have already got down in the previous slide. If you did get all of these points, really, really well done. If you're missing any, no problem, just add them to your list. Okay, so we've already seen about the Kaiser and how he tried to build up the German Navy. Now, you might remember from before that 84% of their war expenditure, that is what they spent on the First World War, was actually borrowed. So they were heavily in debt even before reparations came into play. At the end of the war, so before reparations, Germany was already in debt 1.44 billion marks. Now that is why their currency is at a normal level. It's not, after hyperinflation. So that is a substantial amount of debt that they are in. They also then have to pay reparations. Now remember that the Treaty of Versailles was signed in June 1919, but they don't actually decide how much Germany's going to have to pay until 1921. And when they do decide it, they decide £6.6 billion, or the equivalent of 132 billion gold marks. So it's a lot of money that they're having to pay there. The government not only needed to pay its debt and the reparations, but don't forget that they also promised to pay people like the soldiers for their efforts in the First World War. They had to pay pensions to them, and they also had to pay pensions to the war widows, of which there were hundreds of thousands of them. So the German government, before we even look at the problem of reparations, was in quite a difficult position already. Okay, so you can just pause here if you need to add anything else in. The first of the two problems we're going to be looking at today is something called the invasion of the Ruhr. Now the Ruhr is an industrial area of Germany where there's lots of factories and where it makes a lot of money. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to watch this video, which I've linked here. Now it's about 8 minutes long. You don't need to watch it all. You only need to watch the first 3 minutes or so, which recaps and tells you all about what happened when the French invaded the Ruhr and why they did this. So what I'd like you to do is just pause this video and then go on to that link and then watch that film for me, please. Just the first 3 minutes. So you've now been introduced to this event called the Invasion of the Ruhr, which happens in January 1923. Now, like we've done before, we're going to make a fact file so that it's really easy for us to revise from in the future, because these problems that we've been looking at, the political problems last week and the economic problems this week, they do come up very frequently in exams. So we want to make sure our notes are really good and that we're ready to be able to revise from them. Now, if you have a printer, you can print it from Show My Homework. Document's just called Week 7 Sheets to Print, and then there's 2 pages there. But if you don't have a printer, that's absolutely fine. Then you just need to copy down this fact file that's on the left. So let's talk through it so that you can then pause it afterwards and then make your notes. So when did this happen? As we've already mentioned, this happens from January 1923. That's when the French first invaded. It happens in the Ruhr, which is the industrial heartland of Germany. It's essentially where most of their factories are. The French aren't just going to invade some kind of countryside. They want to make sure that they're able to take as many goods as possible from Germany. So who was involved? 60,000 French and Belgian troops. That number eventually increased to 100,000. And the reason why it's French and Belgian troops is they are the two nations that received reparation payments from Germany, and therefore they're the ones that are very bitter and resentful when Germany isn't paying. So they go there to try and seize the goods by force. They believe that they want to get their reparations money, and they believe that the Germans are withholding it, so they decide to go and take it in the form of goods. And they did this because Germany had missed the second reparation payment. So let's go through it in a little bit more detail now and talk about the key things that you need to know. Okay, so as we've already talked about, the Treaty of Versailles said that Germany was going to have to pay reparations, but it didn't say how much. They only said how much Germany was going to need to pay in 1921. And when they did that, they said it was going to be £6.6 billion worth. Now, they talked about how they wanted that to be paid in equal instalments every year, and that they weren't going to pay in German currency because of very complicated financial issues. But essentially they said, we want you to pay us in gold, raw materials, or manufactured goods. So they had things like coal that they had to give, but remember they made it even more difficult for them to pay by taking things like the Saar coal fields away from them. And they were also asking them for other materials as well, like gold and manufactured goods. Now the German government managed to kind of scrape together that first year's payment in 1921, and it was the equivalent of about £50 million. Now that was really difficult for them to pay for, but they managed to get it together and they handed it over to the French and the Belgians. However, this is all Germany said that they could pay. So in 1922, when it came to them paying their second instalment, they couldn't pay it. Now, because of the poor history and the bitter relations between them, the French refused to believe that Germany didn't have the money and that they couldn't pay. They thought they were just withholding, and they thought that was really unfair. Because remember that France had been really destroyed in the First World War. Remember, going back to conflicts and tension, that an area the size of Wales had been destroyed in France. That is where all the trenches were dug, in France and Belgium. That is where the mass graveyards are. So they had said that their country had been ruined, and therefore they didn't believe that Germany couldn't pay to try and help rebuild it. So they decided to get revenge and to go and invade Germany and occupy the Ruhr area, which is the richest industrial area. Within days, 60,000 troops had invaded, and this is actually completely legal under the Treaty of Versailles. It did say that if Germany couldn't afford to pay or wouldn't pay, then the French and the Belgians could go and invade. So the French went in. They took over things like coal mines, railways, factories, steelworks, anything that was there to make money. They did things like setting up machine gun posts overlooking town squares. Now imagine how horrific that would be for Germans to feel that threatened in their own local area by the French. And it's not like the government can go and send in the army to go and protect them. Because remember, the army has only got 100,000 men. It's really, really weak now. And the government's in a really difficult position where they need to act against the French, but they can't risk upsetting the French that much because they can't go to war with them. They haven't got the army for it. So they're a really difficult financial situation and a really difficult political situation where they're caught between these two sides. But the German people expect them to do something to protect them. So the German government, knowing that they can't go to war with France, instead orders a policy of passive resistance. This is essentially asking all of the workers that work in the Ruhr to go on strike. Because in their mind, they think, well, the Germans can't take any goods if we're not producing any goods. So they said that they would carry on paying these striking workers if they didn't go to work. But that's really, really difficult for them financially, as we're going to see, because it means that they're having to not only still pay, for instance, reparations, but they're also going to really struggle having to now pay all these thousands of striking workers. Now, the French weren't very happy with this either, and you can see here the way the French responded to this passive resistance. They were so angry that they expelled over 150,000 people from the area, kicked them out of their homes and said, you're not allowed back, we don't want you in this area. But they also killed 132 German people, including a 7-year-old boy that had got caught in the crossfire. So you can imagine the anger of the German people at this point, the fact that in their mind, the government hasn't necessarily protected them, and now you've got French people going into their country and killing civilians just to get reparations. So what I'd like you to do is to pause this video here and make notes using that fact file. Okay, so we've already kind of alluded to why this is going to be a problem for the government, but I'd like you to pause the video and have a little think about how much this would affect the government. So I want you to think about what would be the economic impact of all those strikes, and also how would people generally feel about the German government now that the French have invaded and they've ordered this policy of passive resistance. So pause the video here and just have a little think about what you'd say about these two headings here. You don't have to write anything down, just have a little think. So you've had a little think on your own. Now what we're going to do is just have a look at some really key points about why this was a problem for the government. Now remember, this is the really key stuff that turns us from a grade 4 or 5 into those top grades of 6s, 7s, 8s and 9s. It's really important. So I'd like to put a new subheading of how it caused problems for the government, and then you need to copy out or make notes on the following points. Bear in mind that if you just did the fact file on lined paper, you need to just put this as a heading and write it down. If you printed out the sheet, there's a box for you to make these notes in. So let's talk through them. So first of all, we can't underestimate the political impact of this invasion of the Ruhr. It was a complete disaster for the Weimar government, because to try and end it, they had to ask workers to passively resist, which then led to the French acting really harshly, killing those 132 people and expelling 150,000 people from the region. And lots of Germans blamed the government for this and said, why weren't you protecting the people? So there was a real political impact to this. Second of all, there was a massive economic impact too. Now, we're going to look at that problem of hyperinflation, which we've already been introduced to, that problem where, people were burning money rather than buying wood, where people were playing with money rather than playing with toys. So this actually caused the collapse of the German currency. It caused this thing called hyperinflation because the government continued to pay striking workers when they had no money. And in order to pay the striking workers when they don't actually have any cash, they printed more money to be able to do that. And that meant there was too much money in circulation, and it caused this problem called hyperinflation. The problem was that workers weren't going to work, they were on strike. They then started to spend their money more because they were free during the day, they were going out more and so on. And because there was more demand for goods, shopkeepers started to put their prices up. And then the faster prices went up, the faster people spent their money, because you don't want to be caught in a position where you're buying the same good a few days later and you have to pay more for exactly the same good. So soon it created this condition where workers were being paid twice a day and having to take their wages home in a wheelbarrow because money wasn't worth the same as it was before. So essentially, the economic impact is massive because it causes hyperinflation, which also caused quite high unemployment. So almost a quarter of people were unemployed by the end of 1923. So what I'd like to do is just pause that video and make some notes. Now we've already talked about hyperinflation quite a lot, but we're going to now actually look at it in more depth and look at making our notes on it as well. So we've already mentioned that this had a massive financial impact on people, but here's just a few stories to give you a real idea about how big a deal hyperinflation was and how quickly the financial situation changed. Now here are 3 stories from 1923. There was one person who left their suitcase unattended and found that a thief had stolen the suitcase but tipped out all of the money. Another one where a boy went to go and buy 2 breads and when he stopped to play football, he then got to the shop afterwards and found that the price had gone up so he could only buy 1. Another example about one father set out for Berlin to buy a pair of shoes, but when he got there, he found he could only afford a cup of coffee and the bus fare home. So you can see how much prices change. Even on the same day, people found that they couldn't buy the goods in the afternoon that they could in the morning. So essentially the currency devalued so quickly. So as with all the other problems, we're going to be making a fact file. Now you're probably glad to hear this is the last one we're doing, not only for this week, but for next week too. And then we've covered all of the Weimar problems that we need to know about. So let's have a little look at hyperinflation then. So this is something that happened really in the summer of 1923, and it goes on into about November 1923 as well. And this is a problem that doesn't just affect, the capital city, it affects everywhere in Germany because it's the collapse of the German currency that's happening. Now, the reason why it happened is because of the German government, the fact that they printed more money to pay those striking workers who they'd asked to go on strike after the French had invaded the Ruhr. So those 2 events of the invasion of the Ruhr and hyperinflation are very much linked. You can't really separate them very well. So let's have a little look at the details. Now, inflation, and that is where your currency has less value, had been a problem for a while. So it wasn't like all of a sudden it started in 1923. It's been something that's been slowly building for years. For instance, if we're thinking about prices in 1920, they were 14 times higher than they had been before the First World War in 1913. So let's take, for instance, a loaf of bread, what might have been 1 mark in 1920, 1 mark in 1913, had then gone up to about 14 marks by 1920. So it already had a substantial impact. Now, the Ruhr, we know, had been invaded, and we know that the French were stealing their resources, and the government had ordered the workers to passively resist. They said that they'd carry on paying their wages, even though they didn't have the money, and therefore they had to print money to be able to do that. Now that resulted in prices increasing drastically as people have less trust in their currency. Now, when we have our currency, what we do is we link it to something, for instance, gold that we have in the Bank of England. So every government doesn't just print out as much money as they want because it causes this problem of hyperinflation. They have to print out a certain amount of money and only have a certain amount in circulation. Because when you think about it, the actual money itself isn't really worth that much, is it? It's just a piece of paper with the Queen's face on it. The reason why money is so important is that we have confidence that that £5 or that £10 is worth a certain amount of goods. And if people lose confidence in the currency, it then means that it causes this problem of inflation, essentially. So as prices rose, workers were asking for higher wages so they could afford to buy goods still. That means that then factory owners have to put prices up further so they can afford to pay their workers, and it causes what's called this inflation spiral. Now, by the end of 1923, the Reichsmark, that's the German currency, had become completely worthless. People no longer had any trust in their paper money. We talked about before the fact that a loaf of bread now costs 200 billion marks. They were having to print trillion mark notes as well to be able to try and keep up. And with paper money worth nothing, industry couldn't run properly, there's unemployment, and essentially the German economy was on the edge of total collapse. So this is a dire economic circumstance for many, many people, and there were lots of what we call losers of hyperinflation. The majority of German people lost out because of this. So for instance, let's say you're on a fixed income like a pensioner. Well, actually their amount that they got didn't increase quick enough with the new value of the German currency. So for instance, in the month of August, let's say they got 100 marks. Well, now the prices have increased lots, but they don't change it in that month of August. They only get that set amount of money. So it means that people on fixed incomes like pensioners and people with war pensions, they are in a really tough position because they're not getting enough money. If we think about another group as well that lost out a lot, the middle classes lost a lot because they were the groups that tended to save more. Now imagine that you'd worked hard for your whole life and let's say you'd saved 100,000 Reichsmarks. Well, all of a sudden now, they can't even buy you an egg and they never get that money back. The German government cannot afford to give people back their life savings, so they lose that forever. So imagine how angry you'd be. Your life savings gone forever and you can't get them back. However, there are some people that were what are called the winners of hyperinflation, people that did benefit to some extent. So for instance, if you were really heavily in debt, let's say you'd got a really enormous mortgage, all of a sudden now you can afford to pay off your mortgage or your loan straight away because you've signed a contract for a certain amount of money. And now that money's basically worth nothing. So you could pay off your mortgage for this, the same cost as a loaf of bread or half a loaf of bread. So for some people, they did benefit, and some people also sold a lot of goods on the black market because people stopped using currency and they traded things more. So some people did win out, but actually the majority of the people really suffered because of hyperinflation. So I'd like to pause this video here and make some notes. Same as before, I'd like you to try and think about why would this be a problem for the government. So I want you to try and think about the economic impact of this and how it would affect Germany, but also how do you think people would feel about the German government as a result of hyperinflation. So just pause the video here and have a little think. You come up with some of your own points now, and let's see what we can add as well about why this was a problem for the government. So put this as a new subheading, unless of course you've printed the sheet and then you can just write it in that box at the bottom. But we need to make some notes about why was this a problem for the government so we can get past a grade 5. So let's have a little look at the points here. Now, first of all, obviously we've got, it's a problem in terms of the economic impact. Germany's currency was completely destroyed. Actually had to call in all of these old currency called the Reichsmark, burn it, and then they gave them a new currency that they'd have more faith in. So it had an enormous economic impact. But even more important to some people is the political impact of this. Now, many Germans believed that something had to be done and a new government was needed. People thought that the idea of printing money was a really silly idea, and actually, the experts to do with the economy and the government should have actually warned them about that and stopped doing that. So there are lots of people that are saying a new government is needed, especially the middle class, because remember they'd lost their life savings and they never forgave the Weimar Republic for it. And that's a really big deal because the middle classes were quite often the people that had been most supportive of the Weimar government. So losing their support was a really big deal. It did enormous political damage. People had another reason to hate and blame them, and that's on top of things like, they signed the Treaty of Versailles, paying reparations in the first place, letting the German army be reduced to 100,000. So it adds to that already existing anger and frustration at the government about them being November criminals, about them being weak, all of that. And there are lots of historians that actually say that without hyperinflation, Hitler might not have actually come to power. Now, obviously, he's helped by things like the Great Depression, and we'll look at this in lots of detail in September. But actually, maybe if they hadn't suffered through hyperinflation first, the German people wouldn't have resorted to Hitler during the Great Depression because they might have had more faith that the government can fix it. But because the government hadn't been able to fix hyperinflation properly, and then the Great Depression is on top of that, some people say that actually this is the main reason why Hitler is able to come to power, is that people had lost faith in the government because of hyperinflation. So in some ways, it's a long-term reason of why Hitler was able to come to power. So I'd like you to pause the video here and then make some notes on this, please. Okay, so we're on to the final couple of tasks now. Now, the first thing I'd like you to do as a consolidation task is to write a paragraph with your opinion in it. And you've got to try and talk about which economic problem do you think posed the biggest threat to the Weimar government? Do you think it was the invasion of the Ruhr or hyperinflation? So remember, this is just your opinion, you can't be wrong, and I'd like you to then submit it to your teacher on Show My Homework or email it to them once you've done. So pause it here to have a go at that. The second task I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think about this week's work and last week's work. So I want you to think about, do you think the economic or political problems were a greater threat to the Weimar Republic? Which one essentially do you think was more likely to lead to the overthrow of the government? Do you think it was economic problems or political problems? That's quite similar to an exam question that you could get, and we'll talk more about that when we come back in September. So again, if you pause the video here to have a go and then send it to your teacher afterwards, please. Okay, so well done for completing the written work for today. Just one quick final task, which is to go on to Show My Homework and do the quiz. Remember, you're aiming for 100% and you can have up to 3 goes. So if you don't quite get 70 or even 100%, maybe read through your notes and then have another go. Okay, so well done. Thank you for doing the work this week.